Radio 97, let's talk some law. Our resident lawyer, Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay. With us each and every Thursday, she brings her legal expertise, provides some general advice on the latest hot topics. She has experience that spans more than 25 years in the area of property and commercial law. She prepares wills as part of estate planning and litigation, and quite a bit more besides. She's with us once again. Hi, Despina.
Hi, Wayne. Hi, Brooke.
Good morning, Despina. Good morning, Wayno. Another week of talking law, and this time we're starting off with a question from lovely Chantel in Robina. Thank you so much to Chantel for writing this in. She sent an email and said, basically, it's a bit of a lengthy email, but she did say that she's building a granny flat on her property, and she said it was encouraged by the government to do so. Her property's in Robina, Queensland, and then she said, "We've just found this, though." I think she's a bit concerned. So this is a quote from REIQ, and it said, "Would also like to issue a word of warning to homeowners. It's important to do your research to understand the potential tax implications that this could create in terms of capital gains tax, as well as potentially triggering land tax liabilities under recent land tax reforms." Well, in regards to this granny flat being built on her property, and she goes, "I've already started building." What's this about? So, Despina, that is your question from Chantel in Robina.
Can you help?
Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about this generally. Okay, and when I saw that question, I know you sent it to me before the show. There's a lot of issues in that one question. Covers a multitude. Yes, covers a multitude of things. So what I will say, first of all, is it is clearly a question that Chantel should go and talk to her accountant about. If she doesn't have an accountant, she needs to go find someone. That's good. That will be able to help her, because the majority of the answer to her question is tax related. Okay, so we're not accountants or tax advisors, and we don't profess to provide specific tax advice. We can talk about the granny flat arrangements generally, because I am aware of it, and we have helped clients in the past provide a granny flat document, an agreement that's acceptable by state government, or I should say, sorry, federal government, by Centrelink, which is a requirement. And we can talk about some of those things generally, and perhaps some of the capital gains tax exemptions that may apply, which then may lead into land tax. But clearly it's a question that she's got to go and see an accountant. So I really, really would encourage her to do that straight away and to get that advice in writing. And certainly we can talk about it generally, but to get any clear answers, particularly if she started building already. So everything has consequences, and once you start building, and it might start to trigger certain things already that you'll have to perhaps go back and decide whether that's the right way or the wrong way, or so that's why advice up front is so important. So let's talk about granny flat arrangements. So granny flat arrangements is essentially a written agreement that basically provides for an agreement for accommodation for life for either a family member or a friend to an eligible person. Okay, and the eligible person, and all this information is available on the ATO's website. There's a lot of really good information, and I would encourage Chantel and others to go have a look at that. So if you go onto the ATO website and just type in granny flat arrangements, all of it comes up.
Okay,
so cool. You can easily have a look at that, and it's quite easily readable. And I think you can understand that. But look, it's generally, as I said, an arrangement where, say, for example, you have an elderly parent, and they want to now start transferring their primary residence to their adult children or a particular child, right? So what generally happens with these arrangements, this is just one example, is they would transfer the house to their adult child, for example, but in return, right, they get the protection and security because they get an accommodation for life, a life interest. So this granny flat arrangement is a document that sets out those rights, and it sets out that, yes, we're transferring it for, nil consideration if that's the case, or from a nominal consideration. So she's already taking care of the inheritance part. She's transferring the asset to her adult child, and then in return she gets to stay there as if she still owned it, but she doesn't own it. She's transferred ownership, legal ownership, and she gets to stay there for her life. So until she dies, or typically until she can no longer live there because she requires special care, So then she goes into a particular nursing home or other sort of facility or accommodation. And generally you see there's no rent. So that's where in the question Chantel mentioned about, I think, tenants and rent being paid down the track. So when I read the full question, so typically with these arrangements, you see there is no rent, right? And there's no rent payable at market value. The idea is that it's part of this restructuring in a family, for example, or a friend, that where they qualify. So, and the qualification we'll talk about in a minute, but essentially that's the type of arrangement we're talking about. And that's just one example. Okay. And you could have other examples where, you know, the parents sell their home for, say, 500,000, and then that's put away to buy another property, but it's bought in the child's name, you know, the adult child's name, and then they get to stay there for life. So it all comes back to this accommodation for life interest. And when you talk about the eligible people that can participate in this type of arrangement, we're not talking about your average renters. When I say renters, people who just live in granny flats.
Yep.
So I wasn't really sure with Chantel whether she was talking about, oh, I've got a granny flat at the back and I'm going to rent it to, you know, Joe Blow, or are you actually talking about the real granny flat arrangements that are allowed and recognised by the ATO, right? So that they're quite different. And then when you talk about those arrangements and eligible people, you are talking about people who, for example, have reached the pension age, right? Or require assistance for day-to-day activities due to a disability for at least 12 months. So there's your eligibility criteria. So you're not talking about people who, you know, you're renting to, you know, 25 or 30-year-olds or 45-year-olds, unless there's a disability involved. And then you'd have to look at that a bit further. So yeah, as I said, the typical arrangement, you're looking at an older individual with a younger adult child. Okay. And that's the estate planning, restructuring arrangement that we're talking about. And it can be quite conducive to helping your parents when they get to that older stage where they do want to restructure and they want to move their assets around. They want to take care of their estate planning now and give them that security and comfort for their lifetime.
Yep. You talked about this involves people who are, I guess it's a for the rest of your life arrangement. What happens to that arrangement when that person dies?
Yeah, so this is where that agreement is super important, and you've got to document. So to protect the person, first of all, you've got to document their security that they can stay there for their life. They don't pay rent. They generally pay utilities, right? But that's all they need to do, and maintain the home, of course. But then you've got to cover off the circumstance. Well, when does the life interest end? So typically when the person dies, sure. If the person becomes completely incapacitated and you can no longer, or it's not the best interest for them that they can stay in the home on their own, or maybe you can get care, but eventually perhaps it's not working out in the way that it should. So then they've got to move into other accommodation suitable, like nursing home accommodation. Then the life interest would end because they vacated the home, for example. Okay. Or maybe there's an agreement to sell and do it again in another home. Under the same arrangements.
Yeah. So in terms of like, say if Chantel is having just wanting to use this granny flat as a form of maybe a side income, and have, say, her son's friend needs a place to stay and she's renting it out to them, that's where you're saying definitely you need a information from an accountant. And
well, you need information from an accountant whatever way you're going. So, and that's why the question wasn't really, we weren't sure which sort of pathway that Chantel was talking about. So are we talking about, look, I've got a home, but I've got a granny flat at the back, and whether she's got council approval or not, whether there's a dual occupancy requirement, but I'm going to rent it out to whoever, versus the true granny flat arrangement that I'm talking about, which is recognised by the ATO. And we're talking about older people, parents typically, where their adult children are going to help them in this sort of transition. And they're eligible to be able to participate in such arrangement. But regardless of that, either way, there are tax consequences, and you're talking about capital gains tax particularly, and land tax. And that's where you need to talk to an accountant. Because, for example, your granny flat arrangement I'm talking about, there are capital gains tax exemptions that are available, but you've got to tick certain boxes. Okay. And that's why you've got to talk to your accountant to make sure that you can qualify for those capital gains tax exemptions when the granny flat arrangement commences, but also when it ends and when you sell the property down the track, which typically, if you're not living there, would trigger a capital gains tax liability. So you can see it's quite intricate and quite specific. So there's not one answer for Chantel. What Chantel needs to do, if I can say, is go and talk to an accountant today, sort out what she's actually doing and get some advice about capital gains tax, land tax, and anything else in terms of tax liabilities, in terms of how she owns the property, restructuring, all sorts of things that she needs to look at.
Yeah, because it is, depending on who's going in there, very complex. It could change completely.
That's right. And we haven't talked about the council aspect. You just touched upon it briefly before, but you've got to make sure that any approvals that you need to obtain for that arrangement should be in place.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Despina. And coming up next, new strata reform laws in Queensland. Some big news coming up in the next segment on Talking Law. You're listening to Radio 97.
Are you confused about legal jargon? Do you need legal advice but don't know where to turn? Tune in to Talking Law with Despina Priala every Thursday morning at 8:30 on Radio 97. Despina, a leading lawyer with over 20 years of experience, will demystify the law and provide practical advice to help you navigate legal issues. Whether it's a family matter, a property dispute, or a business concern, Talking Law has got you covered. Don't miss out on this valuable resource. Tune in to Talking Law with Despina Priala every Thursday morning at 8:30 on Radio 97.